It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where time seemed to drag its feet. The golden sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting lazy shadows on the living room floor. I sat sprawled on the couch, flipping through TV channels without really watching anything. My best friend, Jason, had gone out for the day, leaving me to kill time at his house. We had been inseparable since childhood, and his place felt like a second home to me. Then my phone buzzed. Jason's name flashed across the screen. "Hey man," I answered, expecting a casual chat about our weekend plans. His voice, however, carried an unusual urgency. "Listen, I won't be around for the next hour or so. My mom's not feeling well, and I need to pick up some stuff for her. You good to hang out till I get back?" I sat up straighter, the relaxed afternoon suddenly tinged with an unexplainable tension. "Yeah, no problem. Is she okay?" There was a slight hesitation before he answered. "She's been kinda off the past few days. Maybe just tired. Anyway, I'll be back soon." Before I could ask more, the call ended. I leaned back, frowning. Mrs. Carter, Emma, was someone I had known for years. She was always warm, kind, the kind of mom who made you feel at home even if you weren't hers. I had never given much thought to how she was doing, though. To me, she was just Jason's mom, a permanent fixture in the background of our friendship. I shook off the unease and resumed flipping through the channels. 15 minutes later, a knock at the door made me sit up. I wasn't expecting anyone. As I opened the door, I found Mrs. Carter standing there. She looked exhausted. Her usual bright blue eyes were dull, framed by dark circles, and her hair was tied up in a loose bun as if she hadn't had the energy to do more. She was wearing a sweater, even though the late summer air was warm. "Hey there," she greeted, her voice softer than usual. "Hey, Mrs. Carter," I said, stepping aside. "Jason just left to grab some things for you." "I know," she replied, giving me a weak smile. "That's why I thought I'd ask for a little favor." I nodded immediately. "Of course. What do you need?" She hesitated. "I've been feeling a bit off, and I need a few things from the store. Just some groceries and medicine. I hate to ask, but I don't want to wait for Jason to hit back." I studied her face. She looked more than just a bit off. Something was wrong. Still, I didn't question it. "No problem," I said quickly. "Just give me a list." Her lips curved into a grateful smile as she handed me a small piece of paper. "Thank you, really." I grabbed my keys and headed out. The whole drive to the store, I couldn't shake the strange feeling settling in my gut. Something about the way she had looked at me, the tiredness in her eyes. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper, something heavier. I got the items on her list and returned within 20 minutes. When I walked back into the house, she was sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. As soon as she heard me, she looked up and tried to smile, but the weight in her eyes was undeniable. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done without you." I set the bags down on the counter, watching her carefully. "Are you sure you're okay, Mrs. Carter? You don't look so good." She let out a soft chuckle, but it lacked any real humor. "I suppose I don't, huh?" She leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. "It's just a lot, you know. Being a single parent, keeping up with work, making sure Jason has everything he needs. I think it's finally catching up with me." I didn't know what to say. I had never seen her like this before. Mrs. Carter had always been the strong, put-together woman who made everything look easy. But here she was, looking like she was barely holding herself together. "You're doing an amazing job," I said honestly. "Jason never talks about it much, but I know he appreciates everything you do." She smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That means a lot." There was a moment of silence between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. I had always seen her as Jason's mom, never as a person with struggles of her own. And now, as she sat there, vulnerable in a way I had never imagined, I felt an unfamiliar pang of empathy. "I'm here if you ever need anything," I found myself saying. Really? She looked at me, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in her expression. Something raw. Something vulnerable. Thank you, she whispered. She leaned forward slightly, her body language softer now. I could feel the weight of her exhaustion, the loneliness in her words. It was the first time I had truly seen her as more than just Jason's mom. It was the first time I realized that she was a woman who had been carrying the world on her shoulders for far too long. And it was the first time I felt the unsettling sense that this was just the beginning of something that neither of us saw coming. The next few days passed in a blur. Jason and I stuck to our usual routine. Hanging out, playing games, talking about things that didn't really matter. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, something felt different. It wasn't anything Jason had done. It was his mom. Ever since that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at me. Not in an inappropriate way, but different. There was something in her eyes that I couldn't quite place, something unspoken. She had always been Jason's mom, a background figure in my life. But now, I couldn't get her out of my head. I told myself it was just concern. She had looked exhausted, struggling with something she clearly hadn't told Jason about. That was why I was thinking about her so much. That had to be it. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. A silent cry for help. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I got another call from Jason. "Hey man," he said, his voice hurried. "I gotta do a few things with my dad today. You mind stopping by my place, just in case my mom needs anything?" Jason's dad had been out of the picture for years. Every few months, he popped back into Jason's life with promises of spending time together, only to disappear again for weeks at a time. Jason acted like he didn't care, but I knew better. "Yeah, sure," I said without hesitation. "I'll head over now." When I arrived at their house, I knocked, expecting the usual routine. A brief hello, maybe a request to grab something from the store again. But this time, Mrs. Carter took longer than usual to open the door. When she did, the sight of her stopped me in my tracks. She looked worse than before. Her face was paler, her hair disheveled like she hadn't bothered to fix it. She was still wearing that oversized sweater, despite the warm air. But the thing that stood out the most was her eyes. They were red-rimmed, like she had been crying. She quickly wiped at her face and forced a smile. "Oh, hey, I said carefully, stepping inside. "You okay?" She let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Do I look okay?" I hesitated. Honestly, no. That seemed to catch her off guard. She let out a shaky breath and rubbed her temples. "Jason's not here, right?" I shook my head. "He's with his dad for a bit." She nodded, looking relieved. "Good. I don't want him to see me like this." That made something inside me twist. I watched as she walked to the couch and sat down slowly, as if every movement drained the last of her energy. I sat down too, unsure of what to say. After a long silence, she spoke. "I don't know why I called you here," she admitted, staring at her hands. I didn't want to be alone." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. "You're not alone," I said quietly. She smiled weakly but didn't say anything. I could tell she was fighting some invisible battle. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was loneliness. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I didn't press her. Instead, I stayed. I let the silence settle between us, giving her space to talk if she wanted to. Minutes passed. Then finally, she sighed. "You ever feel like you're drowning?" she asked suddenly. I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the hem of her sweater. Like you're treading water, but no matter how hard you try, you just keep sinking." I frowned. "Yeah, I think everyone feels that way sometimes." She let out a hollow laugh. "Not like this." I had no idea what to say. I had never seen Mrs. Carter this vulnerable before. She had always been the strong one. the one who kept everything together. But now, she looked like she was falling apart, and I had no idea how to stop it. A moment that changed everything. I used to think I could handle everything on my own. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. When Jason's dad left, I told myself I didn't need anyone. I could be both a mother and a father. I could work full-time and still be there for Jason. I could do it all. She shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. And for a while, I did. I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. But now, she whispered, now I feel like I'm barely keeping it together. I could see the tears in her eyes. She blinked quickly, trying to push them back, but one slipped free. Before I could stop myself, I reached out. I didn't even think about it. I just did it. My hand closed over hers gently, grounding her in the moment. She inhaled sharply, her gaze snapping to mine. For a second, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The air between us felt different, charged, like something unspoken had been lingering there all along, waiting for this exact moment. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she just looked at me. Really looked at me. And in that moment, I saw her, not as Jason's mom, but as a woman. A woman who had been carrying the weight of the world for far too long. A woman who was finally breaking under the pressure. A woman who, for the first time, wasn't trying to hide it. I should have let go. I should have stepped back. But I didn't. Instead, I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone," I said again, softer this time. Something in her expression shifted. She looked at me like I had just said the one thing she had been waiting to hear. Like she had been holding on for so long, waiting for someone to remind her that she wasn't drowning alone. For the briefest second, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. Just me and her. Just the silence between us. Then, just as suddenly as the moment had arrived, she pulled her hand away. She cleared her throat, blinking rapidly. I should probably make some tea. I exhaled, nodding. Yeah, okay. She stood up, walking toward the kitchen, but I could still feel the weight of what had just happened. Something had changed, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew things between us would never be the same again. The next few days felt different. I told myself I was overthinking it, that nothing had actually changed, that the moment between Mrs. Carter and me was just a result of her exhaustion, her stress, nothing more. But I knew better. Every time I went over to Jason's house, I felt it. A shift. Something in the air between us. We hadn't talked about it. We hadn't acknowledged it. But it was there, lingering in the way she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking. In the way she hesitated before speaking. In the way I found myself watching her a little too closely, noticing things I never had before. Jason remained completely unaware of anything. To him, life went on as usual. We played games, grabbed food, made plans for the weekend. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking a tightrope, and I had no idea where it was leading me. The weight of silence. One evening, Jason and I were sitting on the porch, the sun setting in the distance. His dad had bailed on him again, and though he acted like it didn't bother him, I could tell he was frustrated. "Same old story," he muttered, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. "Tells me he'll come, then something urgent comes up. Whatever." I knew better than to push him to talk about it. Instead, I just nodded. "That sucks, man. You want to do something this weekend. Get your mind off it." Jason exhaled and shrugged. "Yeah, maybe." Before I could say anything else, the door opened behind us. I turned to see Mrs. Carter stepping outside, holding a cup of tea. The moment our eyes met, something flickered in her expression. It was only a second, but I caught it. That unspoken something between us. She quickly looked away, taking a sip of her drink. "Hey, Mom," Jason said, barely glancing up. "Hey, sweetheart," she replied. "You okay?" Jason gave her a half-hearted shrug. "Dad bailed again." She sighed, setting her cup down on the railing. I'm sorry, Jason. You know how he is. Yeah, he muttered. I know. Mrs. Carter ran a hand through his hair, a small motherly gesture. But as she did, her eyes briefly met mine again, and this time, neither of us looked away. Something passed between us, something we both felt but didn't dare acknowledge. I quickly turned back to Jason, trying to act normal. Hey, we should hit up the arcade this weekend. Haven't been there in a while. Jason smirked. Only if you're ready to lose. Yeah. Okay, I scoffed. We'll see about that. Mrs. Carter chuckled softly. Just don't spend all your money in one night. Jason rolled his eyes. We won't. I risked one last glance at her. Her expression had shifted again, guarded now. Like she knew this thing between us was getting harder to ignore. Like she knew we were walking towards something we couldn't take back. The night that changed everything. That Saturday, Jason had plans to hang out with some other friends. I wasn't offended or anything. We did our own thing sometimes. But that meant I had an open evening. And when my phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Carter, I felt my stomach tighten. If you're not busy, could you stop by for a bit? I could use some help with something. I stared at the message for longer than I should have. I could have said no. I should have said no. But I didn't. Yeah, sure. Be there soon. A house too quiet. When I arrived, the house was too quiet. Normally, there'd be some background noise. TV, music, Jason messing around in his room. But tonight, it was just silence. I knocked, and after a few seconds, Mrs. Carter opened the door. She looked different. Not in a bad way. Just different. Her hair was down, soft waves framing her face. She wasn't in her usual sweater and jeans, but a casual black dress. Nothing fancy, just simple and comfortable. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. Hey, she greeted, her voice softer than usual. Come in. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. What's up? I asked, keeping my tone casual. She gestured toward the living room. I just needed some company, I guess. I hesitated. Jason's not home. She shook her head. He's out with his friends. Probably won't be back for a while. Silence stretched between us. A silence too heavy, too charged. I knew I should leave. I should make an excuse, say I forgot I had plans. But my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I followed her to the couch and sat down. She sat beside me, close but not too close. Her hands were resting in her lap, fidgeting slightly, as if she was debating whether to say something. Finally, she let out a breath. I feel like I've been holding everything in for too long. I turned to her, my chest tightening. What do you mean? She hesitated. I mean, I don't know how to do this. Be strong all the time. Pretend I have everything together when I don't. I swallowed hard. You don't have to pretend with me, I said quietly. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. And in that moment I knew this wasn't just some passing thing. This was real. Undeniable. A line we both knew we shouldn't cross, but one we were standing dangerously close to. My pulse pounded. Her gaze flickered to my lips for just a second before she quickly looked away, shaking her head. I shouldn't have asked you to come. I sat back slightly, exhaling. Why? She let out a nervous laugh. Because I don't trust myself right now. A lump formed in my throat. The air felt thick, suffocating. I should have said something. I should have stopped this before it went any further. But instead, I reached out. Just a small movement, my fingers brushing against hers. She inhaled sharply, her eyes locking onto mine again. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We both knew this was dangerous. But for that single moment, neither of us cared. Then, before anything could happen, a noise from outside made us both jump. A car pulling into the driveway. Jason. Reality came crashing down on us like a tidal wave. Mrs. Carter jerked her hand away, standing up quickly. "You should go," she whispered. I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I moved toward the door, I stole one last glance at her. She looked shaken. So was I. I walked out just as Jason stepped inside, completely unaware of what had almost just happened. "Yo, dude, what's up?" he greeted. I forced a smile. "Hey, man. Just stopped by for a sec. Heading home now." As I walked to my car, I could still feel the weight of what had happened, what had almost happened, and I knew, deep down, that this was far from over. A wound left open. The night after that close call, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, my mind a battlefield of guilt, confusion, and something else I refused to name. I knew I should have stepped away. I knew I should have never gone over there in the first place. But the truth was, I wanted to go. That was what terrified me the most. Even now, as I lay staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in my head, I couldn't shake the memory of the way she had looked at me. The way the space between us had all but disappeared. The way she had whispered, "I don't trust myself right now." It was a confession, a warning. And still, I had stayed. Still, I had reached out. And worst of all, I wanted to do it again. Avoidance doesn't fix anything. The next morning, I told myself to stay away. Jason didn't question anything when we hung out that day. He had no idea about the weight of the secret I now carried. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt like a fraud. For the next few days, I ignored Mrs. Carter's texts. They weren't anything out of the ordinary, just casual things. "Hey, thanks for stopping by the other night. Hope you're doing okay. Haven't seen you in a bit. Everything all right?" I left them unanswered, trying to convince myself that distance was the right move. But each day, I felt the weight of her words pressing on my chest. Then, on Friday, Jason and I were at the arcade when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. I tried to act normal. "Everything good." He shrugged. "It's my mom. She just asked if I was with you." A sharp jolt shot through my chest. Jason didn't notice. He typed a quick reply, then put his phone away. Weird. Guess she's just checking in. I forced a smile. Yeah, moms do that. But I knew better. She wasn't checking in. She was asking about me. And I had no idea what to do about it. Crossing the line. I held out for 3 more days. 3 days of pretending nothing had changed. 3 days of acting like I wasn't thinking about her every second. Then, late Sunday night, I caved. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else entirely. But before I could stop myself, I picked up my phone and texted back. "Hey, sorry I've been MIA. You okay?" I expected her to take a while to respond, maybe even to ignore me. Instead, my phone buzzed almost immediately. "Can you come over?" My heart stopped. It was past 10. Jason wasn't home. He had told me earlier he was spending the night at his cousin's. I knew exactly what this was, what it could mean. And yet, I found myself typing back before I could talk myself out of it. On my way. A house no longer feels like a home. The drive over felt like forever. When I pulled up outside the house, it was quiet. The lights inside were dim. I hesitated before knocking. This was my last chance to turn around, to walk away, to pretend none of this was happening. But my knuckles rapped against the door before my mind could catch up. Seconds later, it opened. Mrs. Carter stood there, dressed in an oversized sweater again, her hair pulled into a messy bun. But this time, she wasn't just tired. She looked hollow, like something inside her had broken. "Hey," she said softly, stepping aside. I walked in, swallowing the lump in my throat. "What's going on?" She shut the door behind me, leaning against it for a second like she was gathering her thoughts. Then she exhaled. I didn't want to be alone tonight. Her voice was so quiet, so fragile that something inside me cracked. I nodded slowly. Okay. We stood there for a moment, an entire ocean of unspoken words between us. Finally, she walked toward the couch and sat down, hugging her knees to her chest. I followed, sitting carefully beside her. She didn't look at me, just stared at the floor, her fingers curling into the fabric of her sweater. I feel like I'm disappearing, she whispered. I swallowed. What do you mean? She let out a small, bitter laugh. Like I spent so long being Jason's mom, someone's ex-wife, the woman who has it together, that I don't even know who I am anymore. Her voice trembled. I'm just tired. I stared at her, my chest tightening. You're not just those things, I said quietly. You're more than that. Her head turned, and for the first time since I arrived, she met my gaze. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. And suddenly, I wasn't just seeing Mrs. Carter anymore. I was seeing Emma, a woman, not a mother, a person, not a role, a woman who had been drowning alone for far too long. The air between us grew heavy. Her gaze flickered down to my lids. A shiver ran through me. I should have pulled away. I should have said something to stop this. But instead she whispered, so softly, I almost didn't hear it. I don't want to be alone anymore. And then, before I could even process what was happening, she leaned in. Her lips hovered just inches from mine, waiting, giving me a choice I knew I shouldn't make, a choice I wanted to make. I could feel her breath against my skin. My heart pounded so loudly I swore she could hear it. I closed my eyes. And then, a sharp, sudden knock at the door. We both froze. A second knock, louder this time. My stomach dropped. Jason. Reality crashed down around us like a tidal wave. Mrs. Carter shot up from the couch, her entire body trembling. I stood too, my pulse hammering in my ears. Go, she whispered urgently, panic in her eyes. I hesitated. What if it's... Go, she repeated. The knock came again. I grabbed my keys, my mind spinning, and slipped through the back door just as the front one opened. As I hurried to my car, I could hear Jason's voice. Hey, Mom. Everything okay? I didn't stay to hear her answer. I just got in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had almost done something I could never take back, something that could ruin everything. And yet, as I drove away, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, I couldn't help but wish that knock had never come. Because for one fleeting moment, I wanted to kiss her. And I knew, deep down. So did she. A narrow escape. My heart was still hammering as I pulled away from the house. The night air felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just the shock of what had almost happened. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white as I forced myself to focus on the road. I had nearly crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I regretted it. Jason's voice still echoed in my head, his casual, unsuspecting, "Hey, Mom. Everything okay?" Completely unaware of the tension that had filled the air just moments before. Completely unaware that if he had arrived even 1 minute later, he might have walked into something that would have shattered everything. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. I needed to get a grip. This wasn't some game. This was real. And it was dangerous. An unspoken agreement. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The way she had looked at me. The way she had whispered, "I don't want to be alone anymore." I didn't know how to handle it. And the next day, when Jason texted me to come over like nothing had happened, I felt my stomach twist. For the first time in years, I hesitated. But I knew avoiding him wasn't an option. So I went. When I arrived at the house, Jason greeted me at the door, grinning. "Dude, where were you last night? I texted you to hop on a game, but you never answered." I forced a laugh. "Yeah, I crashed early." Long day. Jason shrugged. No worries. You good? Yeah, I lied. I wasn't good. Because the moment I stepped inside, I felt her presence. Mrs. Carter was in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with something on the counter. But when our eyes met, I saw it. The same weight, the same tension. The unspoken what if still lingering between us. And for a split second, I thought she might say something. Acknowledge what had happened. But she didn't. Instead, she gave me a quick, unreadable glance and turned back to what she was doing. An unspoken agreement. Neither of us would talk about it. Neither of us would acknowledge that we had nearly crossed the point of no return. The illusion of normalcy. For the next hour, I tried my best to act normal. Jason and I played video games, cracked jokes, and talked about school. But every time Mrs. Carter passed by, I felt it again. That lingering tension. That quiet pull. She never said much. Just the usual "do you boys need anything?" or "don't stay up too late." But every word felt measured. Careful. Like she was afraid to let anything slip. And I was the same way. I didn't let myself look at her for too long. Didn't let myself linger when she walked past. Didn't let myself acknowledge the way my pulse jumped whenever she was near. But no matter how hard I tried to suppress it, I couldn't forget. And I knew, deep down, that she couldn't either. A midnight confession. That night, long after Jason had gone to bed, I was lying awake on the couch when I heard movement. Soft footsteps. Then, a faint creak. I turned my head just as Mrs. Carter stepped into the dimly lit living room. She froze when she saw me awake. For a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then, in a whisper, she said, "I didn't think you'd still be up." I sat up slightly, my heart pounding. Couldn't sleep. She hesitated, then walked over, standing near the edge of the couch. She wasn't wearing her sweater this time, just a simple t-shirt and leggings. Nothing revealing, but something about it felt different, softer, more real. She let out a breath and ran a hand through her hair. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I blinked. For what? She gave a sad smile. For putting you in that position. For letting things go too far. I swallowed. You didn't do anything wrong. She shook her head. No, I did. And I know it. I could see it in her eyes. She was wrestling with something inside of her. Something she was trying so hard to push down. I don't know what's wrong with me, she admitted quietly. I feel like I've been lost for so long. Like I don't know who I am anymore. I watched as she hugged her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. I had never seen her this vulnerable before. Never seen her this human. And before I could stop myself, I said, "You're not lost." She looked at me. Then why does it feel like I am? I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, I felt just as lost as she did. The silence stretched between us, filled with 1,000 things neither of us knew how to say. Then, after what felt like forever, she whispered, "We can't do this." I nodded, but my chest ached. I know. She took a shaky breath. But I don't know how to stop thinking about it. A lump formed in my throat. Me neither. She let out a soft, broken laugh. "This is crazy, isn't it?" I nodded. Yeah. And then, just as quickly as she had come, she turned and walked away. Back to her room. Back to the version of herself that she was trying so hard to hold on to. I sat there in the darkness, my heart pounding. We had just acknowledged it. The thing neither of us had dared to say before. And now that it was out in the open, I had no idea what would happen next. Drowning in the silence. The days that followed felt like slow torture. Mrs. Carter and I had finally acknowledged what had been building between us. And now, there was no taking it back. No pretending it wasn't real. No escaping the weight of it. I told myself to stay away, to create distance, but fate had other plans. Jason was going through a rough time after his dad canceled on him again, And naturally, I was around more. More time in their house. More stolen glances when Jason wasn't looking. More of the unspoken tension stretching between us like an invisible thread, pulling tighter and tighter with each passing second. It was suffocating, and yet neither of us made a move to break it. Because deep down, I think we both knew we didn't want to. The moment that changed everything. It happened on a Thursday night. Jason had fallen asleep early, exhausted from basketball practice, and I was about to head home when I ran into Mrs. Carter in the hallway. Literally. I turned the corner, and suddenly, she was right there. Close. Too close. We both froze. Her breath hitched, her eyes wide as they locked onto mine. And for a moment, the rest of the world fell away. It was just her. The faint scent of her shampoo. The way her lips parted slightly in surprise. The way her pulse fluttered at the base of her throat. I knew I should step back. But I couldn't. Neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. And then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "I can't stop thinking about you." My stomach dropped. I swallowed hard. "Mrs. Carter." She flinched. "Don't call me that." I exhaled shakily. "Emma." Her name felt foreign on my tongue. Like I had crossed some unspoken line just by saying it out loud. She closed her eyes for a second, as if steadying herself. Then, when she opened them again, there was something different in them. Something raw. Something dangerous. "I don't know what's happening to me," she whispered. I did. It was the same thing that was happening to me. She took a shaky breath. "We need to stop this. Before it's too late." I nodded, even though every part of me rebelled against the thought. "I know," I said. But neither of us moved. Neither of us stepped away. And that was when I knew. It was already too late. The kiss that shouldn't have happened. It was her. Not me. She was the one who closed the distance first. The one who leaned in. The one who let out a shuddering breath before tilting her chin up ever so slightly, her lips just inches from mine. She hesitated, just for a second. One last chance to turn back. One last chance to stop this. And then, she kissed me, soft at first, hesitant, like she couldn't believe she was actually doing it, like she was giving herself one last chance to pull away. But she didn't. And neither did I. The moment our lips touched, something inside me snapped. I wasn't thinking anymore. I wasn't questioning. I was just feeling. The warmth of her hands as they gripped the front of my shirt. The way her breath hitched as I deepened the kiss. The way she pressed closer, as if she had been starving for this, for me, just as much as I had been starving for her. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself stop fighting it. I let myself want her. Until reality came crashing back. Until she suddenly pulled away. Her eyes were wide, her breathing unsteady, her lips slightly swollen from the kiss. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of what we had just done settling in. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she choked out, "Oh my God." The fallout. She took a step back, then another. Her hands flew to her lips, as if she could erase the feeling of me from her skin. This was a mistake," she whispered, shaking her head. My stomach twisted. "Emma." "No." She cut me off, her voice trembling. "We can't do this. I can't do this." I took a step toward her, desperate to fix whatever had just broken. "I know it's wrong, but nothing." She squeezed her eyes shut, her whole body trembling. "This can't happen again." I swallowed hard. What if I don't want to forget it? She let out a sharp breath, her eyes snapping to mine. "Then you have to try." Her voice cracked on the last word. I wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her that this thing between us was real. But then, we heard Jason's voice from upstairs, half asleep, calling out, "Mom." Emma flinched, like she had just been ripped back into reality, like she had just remembered exactly what was at stake. She turned away from me quickly, rubbing her hands over her face as if trying to compose herself. Then she whispered one last time, "You should go." And this time, I didn't argue. Because I knew she was right. A wound that won't heal. As I walked to my car that night, everything felt wrong. The night air was cold. The stars too bright. The street too quiet. I sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers went numb. I replayed everything in my head. Her lips on mine, her hands gripping my shirt, the way she had pulled away like she had just committed the worst sin imaginable. And worst of all, I could still taste her, even now, even as I forced myself to drive away, even as I told myself to let it go. Because the truth was, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. Running from the inevitable. I didn't go back to Jason's house for an entire week. I told him I was busy, that school was piling up, that I had other things to take care of. He didn't question it. Why would he? To him, nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. I couldn't stop replaying that night. The way Emma had kissed me. The way she had pulled away like it was the biggest mistake of her life. The way she had told me to forget it. As if I ever could. I tried to convince myself that staying away was the right move. That it would help kill whatever this was between us. That time and distance would make it all disappear. But I was wrong. Because the longer I stayed away, the worse it got. A house that no longer feels like home. On the 8th day, Jason texted me again. "Dude, my mom's been acting weird. Everything okay with you too?" I stared at my phone, my heart pounding. He had no idea how loaded that question was. I hesitated before typing back. "Yeah, everything's fine." "Why?" "I dunno. She's been quiet lately, like more than usual. Thought maybe something happened." I swallowed hard. Something had happened, but he could never know. I forced a response. "Nah, man, probably just stress or something." Jason seemed to buy it. "Yeah, maybe. Anyway, you coming over later?" I should have said no. Should have made another excuse. But something in me broke at the thought of her sitting in that house, just as messed up over this as I was. Before I could stop myself, I texted back. "Yeah, be there soon." A conversation we can't avoid. When I stepped into the house, I felt it immediately. The shift. The weight of what we had done. Jason greeted me like nothing was wrong, launching into a story about some girl from school who had rejected his friend. I nodded, laughed at the right parts, pretended to be present. But my mind wasn't on Jason. It was on her. And she knew it. I could feel it every time she passed through the room. The way her eyes lingered on me just a little too long. The way she moved more carefully, as if afraid of what might happen if we got too close again. The way she refused to speak to me directly, only acknowledging my presence when necessary. She was avoiding me. And it was driving me insane. After dinner, Jason went upstairs to shower, leaving me alone in the living room. And just like that, the moment I had been avoiding finally came. Emma walked in. Stopped when she saw me. We locked eyes. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But the silence between us was deafening. Finally, she exhaled and walked toward the kitchen. I couldn't let her leave. Not without talking. Not without fixing this. I stood up, following her before I could talk myself out of it. She stiffened when she heard my footsteps. "Emma," I said, my voice quiet. She swallowed, her back still turned to me. "We shouldn't do this," she whispered. I clenched my fists. "Do what?" "Talk." She exhaled sharply, turning to face me. Her eyes were glassy, tired. "This can't happen," she said firmly, her voice trembling just a little. It was a mistake. I felt something inside me snap. A mistake. She flinched at the frustration in my voice. I took a step closer. "You think I regret it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Because I don't." She shook her head. You don't understand. No, you don't understand. I didn't care that my voice was rising. I didn't care that I was standing too close now, close enough to see the way her hands trembled. You keep running from this like it's something that doesn't matter. Like it's something we can just erase. Her breathing hitched. I lowered my voice. But you and I both know that's not true. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Because she knew I was right. She felt it too. The weight of whatever this was between us, the undeniable pull neither of us could escape. But then, she did what she always did. She stepped back, put space between us, built her walls back up. "I'm Jason's mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And you're his best friend." My stomach twisted. I know. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away. "We can't do this," she said again. But this time, it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than me. I swallowed the lump in my throat, because I knew this was it. This was the end. If I pushed any further, I would break her, and I couldn't do that to her. I let out a shaky breath, running a hand through my hair. "Okay." She frowned. "Okay." I nodded, forcing myself to step back, to let go. "If this is what you want," I said quietly, "then okay." Something flickered in her expression, like she hadn't expected me to surrender so easily, like a part of her didn't want me to. But I had to. For her, for Jason, for all the things we could never have. She stared at me for a long time. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Thank you." A goodbye without saying goodbye. I left the house that night knowing I would never truly be able to stay away. That a part of me would always wonder what could have been. But I also knew that some things weren't meant to happen. That some things were better left unspoken. That sometimes doing the right thing felt like the hardest thing in the world. And as I drove away, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me together, I told myself I had done the right thing. Even if it didn't feel like it. Even if it never would. The weight of walking away. The drive home felt longer than usual. Each red light, each turn, each mile between me and that house felt like a punishment. The right thing wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to make me feel like I was leaving behind a part of myself. But that's exactly what it felt like. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing myself to focus on the road. Forcing myself to accept the decision I had made, because there was no going back now. This was over. It had to be. Avoidance is a form of survival. The next few weeks were a blur. I kept my distance, coming up with excuses every time Jason asked me to hang out at his place. He didn't question it at first, but eventually he did. "Dude, did something happen?" he asked one afternoon, his voice laced with concern. "You haven't been around much." I forced a laugh. "Nah, man, just busy with school, that's all." He frowned. "You sure?" "Yeah," I lied. Because what else could I say? That I had fallen for his mother. That she had kissed me. That we had come dangerously close to ruining everything. No, Jason could never know. Some secrets weren't meant to be shared. And this was one I would take to my grave. An unexpected encounter. 2 months passed before I saw her again. I had managed to avoid her completely, and honestly, I thought maybe, just maybe, I was starting to move on. But then, one evening, I ran into her by accident. It was late. I had stopped at the grocery store to pick up a few things, and when I turned the corner of an aisle, there she was, Emma. For a second, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just stared. She looked different. Not in a drastic way, just tired. Like she hadn't been sleeping well. Like she had been avoiding me just as much as I had been avoiding her. I should have just walked away. Pretended I hadn't seen her. But instead, before I could stop myself, I said, "Hey." Her lips parted slightly, like she was surprised I had spoken first. Then, after a beat, she said softly, "Hey." The silence that followed was suffocating. I had so many things I wanted to say. So many questions. Was she okay? Did she regret everything? Did she miss me? But none of those words came out. Instead, she gave me a small, hesitant smile. "How have you been?" she asked. It was such a simple question. And yet, I didn't know how to answer it. Because the truth was, I hadn't been okay. Not since that night. Not since I walked away from her. But I couldn't tell her that. So I just nodded. "I've been good." She studied me for a moment, as if she didn't quite believe me. Then she nodded too. That's good." Another beat of silence. Then, before I could think too much about it, I said, "Are you?" Her lips parted slightly. "Am I?" "What?" "Okay," I clarified. "Are you okay?" For a second, I thought she wouldn't answer. But then, she let out a soft breath and whispered, "I don't know." My chest tightened. I wanted to reach for her, wanted to tell her that neither was I. That this thing between us had broken me in ways I hadn't expected. But I couldn't. Not here. Not now. So instead, I just nodded. And then, she did something I wasn't expecting. She gave me a small, sad smile. "I'm glad I ran into you," she admitted. I swallowed hard. "Yeah." She nodded. "Yeah." Then she took a deep breath and whispered, "Take care of yourself, okay?" I knew what she meant. She wasn't just saying goodbye for now. She was saying goodbye for good. And I had no choice but to accept it. "You too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She gave me one last look, one last piece of what could have been, before she turned and walked away. I stood there for a long time after she was gone. And even though I had already lost her once, somehow, this felt like losing her all over again. The final goodbye. I never saw her again after that. Not once. A few months later, Jason told me his mom had gotten a job offer in another city. They were moving at the end of the summer. And just like that, she was gone. I should have been relieved. It should have made things easier. But instead, I just felt hollow, like a part of me had disappeared with her. Moving on, but never forgetting. Years passed. Life went on. Jason and I stayed friends, but we never talked about his mom much. He had no idea what had happened between us. No idea how close I had come to crossing a line that could have ruined everything. And I would never tell him. Because some things were better left unsaid. Some things were meant to be buried in the past. But even as I moved forward, even as I built a life without her, there were still nights when I would lie awake and wonder, what if? What if we had met under different circumstances? What if she hadn't been Jason's mom? What if things had been different? But the thing about what ifs is that they don't change anything. They don't undo the past. They don't fix the things that were never meant to be. So instead of dwelling on them, I let her go. Because sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is walk away from something you never wanted to lose.